This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and hope for progress in the sector. With your host, Professor Judyth Sachs, former PVC Learning and Teaching at the University of Sydney, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost at Macquarie University, and Special Advisor in Higher Education at KPMG, and now Chief Academic Officer at Studiosity. Welcome.
I'm introducing Professor Margaret Sheil, the Vice-Chancellor and President of QUT. Margaret's had a very illustrious career, both as Provost at University of Melbourne, but also in charge of the ARC. And you've just finished a review of the ARC, which I'm sure was extraordinarily challenging and interesting. But look, before we start, what would you say about Margaret Sheil?
Look, I don't know, Judith. I think I've always been a curious person, and so one of the things that I think I've always been characterised everything I've done is I've gone into and tried to understand something at some point, and often taken a risk in going there, you know. So I think I'm a courageous person, and I think I'm a curious person, and I think those two things together mean that I've gone down pathways or avenues or done things that other people mightn't have done, either because they were less curious or because they were less courageous.
So when I contacted you, I asked you to bring an object that provided the basis of your understanding you as an educator and as a leader. What have you got?
Look, I guess I'd bring my phone, because I'm always Googling or always checking. And, you know, I used to, as a child or a teenager, we didn't have an encyclopedia, but the people next door did. So I spent half of my life going into the next door neighbours and borrowing various encyclopedias to learn stuff. So I guess I would bring a phone or a book that said I was reading or trying to understand or get information about something so that I could understand something better or do something better.
So and that now links in with your comment earlier about being curious. So talk to me a little bit about how curiosity has framed you both as a scholar, an educator and a leader.
Right. So I think one of the things that I've always tried to, you know, I want to learn about things. So, and that's always been my kind of modus operandi, and whether it's learning about the people, so sort of understanding where people are coming from, or being curious about why things were the way they were, you know, and so I think one of the things that I was curious when I was cleaning out some of my stuff. We'd had a small flood in the Brisbane floods, and I went through the books that were my sort of childhood books, and I found this. My third grade prize for coming first in third grade was a book called Let's Experiment. So this kind of tendency to want to understand something had clearly been there from a very young age, and so I guess and educating others meant that then I would sort of try and understand something, and then once I'd understood something, I'd then want to explain it to people and say, you know this, or you know that. And so as a leader then I tend to not take things on face value. I will and I sometimes surprise people because they go, oh, how could you want that level of detail? But often I want that level of detail to understand it. And then once I understand it, I'll back off and go, okay, that's good. I don't need to keep seeing that detail, but I do need to understand it. And then once I understand something, I find it very easy to explain to others. So I found that with the pandemic, that because I could understand the science of what was happening, it helped me explain the consequences to people as we were making decisions.
So do you think that sort of mindset of curiosity was part of the basis of why you became a chemist, or why you studied chemistry?
I think it was why I did science rather than medicine, for sure. And I just did chemistry because I didn't just do chemistry, but I had a good chemistry teacher at school. That's often the case. I actually liked maths, but I couldn't see the practical bit of maths enough to want to pursue maths. And I thought chemistry was sort of, I found chemistry more interesting than physics. So that was the kind of the choice.
So it was by elimination.
Yeah, it was a little bit of by elimination, yes. And chemistry suited me for that reason. And it is, you know, they don't call it the central science for nothing. It is the science that allows you to then both work in and understand physics, but also biology, and also it's got a kind of quantitative aspect that means that you can deal with data and complexity of data as well.
So what was your undergraduate experience like?
Well, you know, it wasn't as glory days as people talk about. It was pretty woeful, really, in terms of the facilities, in terms of, you know, people talk about they remember university in these golden days, but it was really, that was in the Fraser government, in the period post-Fraser, and where universities didn't have a lot of money. And so it was fine in terms of the content and the you know, what I'd learned. I had a very good education, but it wasn't, you know, the building was bleak. There were a lot of you know, UNSW was a very wasn't a beautiful campus at all at that stage. So that bit wasn't that great. In terms of my actual experiences, I did a lot of extracurricular stuff. I ran the UNSW baseball softball club. I was the president of Students' Chemistry Society. So I was doing the kind of the other dimensions as well. And then, but in terms of my actual education, I mean, it was fine. It was just not, it wasn't, you know, it wasn't too different to what I was teaching my own students, you know, 10 years later, or probably what had happened the 10 years before. It wasn't bad in any way, but it wasn't, you know, people would talk about the universities that they knew and the small classes and the good old days. It wasn't like that. It was much more like our current experiences.
And what about your postgraduate experience?
Well, that was quite different. So we had, I did my PhD with a guy who was he came to UNSW as, you know, in those days you could only be a professor if you were appointed or you'd been there for life. And he was the young professor that was brought in from the probe. He was only 35 when he was made a professor. He had a lab that was sort of world class. He connected with the best people in my discipline and around the world. So I had a pretty good postgraduate experience, a very good postgraduate experience, I realise in retrospect, because I had such a both a very good lab, because he had brought with him 6 PhD students from La Trobe, and then a couple of the other bright students from UNSW, and I all joined the lab. And he was a really interesting and extraordinary scientist. He was a terrible, you know, politician, but he was a great scientist, and I learned a lot. But in 1986, so just about he came from the Trobe with a big mass spectrometer, and we worked on that. And then just towards the end of my PhD, he was offered a job at Warwick, and so he then left and went to Warwick, and me and some of the others, we were left to kind of write up on our own, which was good in a way, because it meant we finished, and you know, we sent our thesis over to him in chapters, and he would read them and send them back. But it meant that I had no security blanket then to hang around. I had to go and get a postdoc and get going, and there was, which was fine, because I did, and I went off to America, and you know, that worked out okay. Whereas at that stage, a lot of people would sort of hang around and do a bit more work as a postdoc or something in their lab. But Peter left and went to Warwick, so that was kind of unusual. Your PhD supervisor doesn't often pack up and take you mass spectrometer out from under you, which it literally.
So when you think back on that, both your PhD experience and your postdoctoral experience, what did you take from that you then used as part of your toolkit of being a young academic?
Well, because Peter wasn't very different to us in age. I mean, he was, I don't know, 10, 12, he was like the young gun in the department, right? And then he became the head of school. And so I learned a lot about, and then I was the student postgraduate rep and the president of the Student Society, Chemistry Society. So I learned a lot about how universities ran through the fact that we were working for the head of school. And the head of school, and because I was sort of interested in people and a good organizer, I knew a lot about what was going on. So I had a pretty good sense of university politics, which helped with the lab, with my young academic. But the other thing I learned a lot from Peter about, and those experiences both there and my postdoc, about forging a new area of research independent of your supervisor and what you'd done before. So I learned to take what I'd done as a PhD student, did as a postdoc, and then created my research program at Wollongong, which was why I was really successful early on in getting grants, because I learned how to synthesize that in a way that quite often early career researchers still end up doing what they did, following on from their supervisor, and that ultimately doesn't help you, because you've got to take the best from each place and meld that together and identify good opportunities. And Peter was very good at seeing the big opportunity in the big picture, and I learned a lot about how that worked and how to pull that together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that built on the curiosity and the being courageous?
Yeah, because just as another example, so when so Peter left and went to the UK, and so there was a couple of other academics in the school who were notionally my supervisors or my on-the-ground supervisors. And this might sound like a big jump to Judyth, but my PhD was in physical chemistry. And so the idea was that you go and work for a top physical chemist, Anyway, meanwhile, a guy who was a biological guy had visited the lab, and he wrote to me and offered me said, if you want to do a postdoc with me, come and do that. And so I wrote to him and he offered me the job, and we went. But everyone's like, but you're doing physical chemistry. What are you doing going to work in a pharmacy school? Right. But so I went and worked in what was called a medicinal chemistry department. Doesn't sound like a big jump, but it was.
Mm-hmm.
And then I came back and sort of pulled those two strands together. And again, it was this idea about not necessarily just doing the same thing, it was taking a jump. And I got there to the medicinal chemistry and the department in America, and I didn't know a lot of stuff because it was actually quite out of my field. But then I knew a lot of stuff they didn't know, as it turned out. So it worked out, but I didn't, that was a bit of it would have been much more traditional to say, go and work with one of the top physical chemists in the field, or quite a lot of people said, well, why don't you follow Peter to the UK? Well, I've learned from him. I don't need to go do that again.
Mm-hmm.
And so I forged out in a different direction, and then again came back to Australia when everyone said, there's never going to be any money for research, and it just happened that things started to move when I got back.
So timing was important.
It was, yeah. And I brought back to Australia some things that other people hadn't sort of experienced. And I went to the ANU for a year. And again, everyone said, just stay here. And I went and I got offered the job at Wollongong, and I went to Wollongong, and everyone's going, what are you doing that for? And I said, well, it feels like a good environment, and Wollongong was fabulous in that period. And yeah, so at each step, I took a step that was what people expected,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's the case.
So what's important to you as an educator?
creating opportunities for people who wouldn't otherwise have them, right? And so if I think about my career, what I've done throughout all my career, regardless of whether it's been in research or education, it's been to provide opportunities to bring excellence to a broader range of people, to allow those who wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to shine or excel. And so whether that's creating opportunities for kids in Wollongong who are first in family and you know, would wander into your office and say, I'm thinking about doing science, but I don't really know what that looks like, or whether it's, you know, promoting opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics or women who in non-traditional areas. I think what's always driven me is that sense that I had a great, even though I said, you know, it was a bit bleak at UNSW in the early 80s, but I still had a very good education. I had a very good high school education. I had opportunities that others wouldn't necessarily have had, and I want to ensure that the greatest number of people have those opportunities.
So were there particular opportunities that you took advantage of?
Look, I think I mean, I had opportunities to I think I took opportunities with risks and I backed myself. So, but I did that knowing that I was going into an environment where I was going to be able to utilize those opportunities. So, yeah, I mean, I didn't. My father's an engineer. My mother was a nurse. My brothers had been to university before me. I wasn't a first in family kind of not. I came first in my high school. It was just down the road from the University of New South Wales, so it's accessible. So I had opportunities to learn and to do things, but it wasn't in. You know, I don't want to pretend I had some kind of that there was adversity in that. There was rebellion because I didn't do medicine and because I didn't do other things that people expected of me. But then I had great. I would be, you know, Wollongong at the time that I was there was really flourishing. Had great leadership. We were given opportunities. We've talked about the characteristics of different institutions. And it backed you if you were prepared to back yourself. So I think those opportunities of people backing me to do things, whether it was the head of school or the vice chancellor or the people who supported me for the ARC, I've tried to do that for others, I think, or for students, you know, in supporting them, supervising them, teaching them.
If we can just move on to the sort of the current context of higher education, it could be said in Australia, we're at an inflection point with the Accord and with your review of the ARC. And everything that I've read about your review of the ARC, it is both courageous, but it's also strategic and forward-looking. So do you want to talk to me about what you think the challenges are facing university in the short and the midterm?
Sure. So we called the ARC review Trusting Australia's Ability, and that name is quite deliberate because it's built on the idea that the last really, really big injection of funding into research in Australia was through the two Backing Australian Ability initiatives in the early 2000s. But the Trusting Australia's Ability is really about trusting that we have incredible talent. There's no need to be culturally cringed about what we've got in our higher education or research sector. And if we trust that talent, we can continue to thrive. And there has been a period in different times of government of not trusting the universities or the talent that we have. So that's the one thing. That's the sort of the logic behind the review, is that we have we don't need to be shy about the quality of the people in our research and higher education sector, both the students coming through and the academics working in it. So that's the first thing. But we've got challenges, and we've got challenges because we've created a system that relies on a set of incentives and funding that is in the international student realm that then doesn't align with the objectives of either what we're trying to do in terms of educating international students, but also to operate the universities. So the inflection point is we've got to work out what we need to have a fully functioning, effective education enterprise to ensure that we can educate our next generation and at the scale and with the level of expertise we need. So we've got to get education right. We've got to recognise and link the research endeavour to that and to the economy, and so we get the settings there right. And then if we have and are engaged with international education, we have to have that right, but we also have to ensure that we provide the highest quality international education as well, and you know, the kind of services that you would expect if you were paying the fees that international students pay, so that we don't, you know, that we fulfil our obligations. And I think they've kind of all got muddled up, and we need to disentangle them and work out which bits are which and what are the right ways of driving each of those, and not obscuring one objective with the other. If that makes sense, and that's not too.
Yeah, no. I understand that, but at the end of the day, it's real clarity around the nation building capacity and the intellectual capacity building of research.
Yeah, and the problem at the moment is there's too many. There's been too many policy levers or drivers that try and do too many different things at once, you know, and so then one will override another. So you once we started introducing values into or cultural kind of constraints into the income contingent loan system and tried to sort of say, well, you know, we're going to give you less money to educate this person than that person or that class of person. It confused the policy levers, it confuses the students and doesn't necessarily achieve what you want. We've had multiple initiatives over the last 15 years to try and make the universities more relevant to business and engage more with industry, and this notion that, you know, they've got to have research that's relevant to their communities. But at the same time, the main source of funding for research has been the premium on international fee revenue, which is driven by international research metrics. So you've got universities saying, responding to that. At the same time, the government's trying to fiddle with the leaders around research commercialisation or industry engagement. And then similarly in the education side, rather than reflecting the cost to either the student or the individual, we've got a kind of confused set of metrics and drivers there. So I think it's that's why I say we've got to disentangle that. If there are trade-offs in that, we need to be explicit about what they are, but not think that by fitting with this policy lever over here, you're going to change an outcome over here when there's some overriding consideration that's going to block that out.
The title of these podcasts has been Reimagining Higher Education. And this is the moment to reimagine it with the Accord. What are some of the elements of a reimagining that you would like to see in place?
Well, I think it needs to be explicable, right? So we need to be able to explain to prospective students what's the value and what will be the value of their education, whether they're domestic, international, graduate, undergraduate, postgraduate. And we need to be able to explain to whoever is doing research or undertaking research or commissioning research what the value of that is and what it's going to cost, right? And if you try and explain our funding arrangements to anybody outside Australia, or you know, you interview someone and they say, well, I'm going to run this school and I'm going to improve the research, and you say, yeah, but the research doesn't pay for itself. So how are you going to actually get international students into your school to generate the income to pay for that research ambition. And, you know, if they come from the UK, the US, Germany, somewhere else, they look at you and go, what do you mean? You know, and so, and then we say, well, we want you to do a humanities degree because you're going to be a really good informed citizen who can write and be the policy leaders of the future. But we're going to charge you a lot more for that because the government doesn't like humanities. And they go, well, what does that mean? You know, should I be doing this or not? And so the disconnect between, so I would like a system that people working in it understood. Not only can you not explain it to people overseas, we can't explain it to prospective students. Our staff don't fully understand it. So, you know, it'd be so much easier to work if everybody understood what the drivers were and what the incentives were and what the policy objectives were. And it's just got all muddled up.
And the job ready graduates, which was a strong push for the previous government, would you see that as being modified?
No, I just think we shouldn't start from there. It's that old line. If this is where we want to, if this is where we want to go, we can't start from there. You can't start from the job ready graduates and design a sensible system. You have to start again. And you know, the job ready graduates was a clever piece of policy that enabled enabled the government to give universities who were quite concerned the security of the funding arrangements. It enabled us, it ensured that we offered more places, and it did provide the flexibility to move between undergraduate and postgraduate, which we've been seeking. So they were good things. But it's now, you know, so many elements of it don't have a good policy foundation that it's not the right place to start.
Mm-hmm. Can we move to student experience? And what for you is a 21st century student experience? What should it be like and what should students expect?
So one of the challenges is they both expect and want everything. And so they want 24/7 support. They want to have university tutorials and opportunities when it suits them. And then they want to have on campus and need to have on campus and social dimensions to their learning as well. And it's a more expensive model to personalise what we can do for students than it has been in the past. The most efficient part of the old system was standing in front of a group of first years and lecturing to 400 students. Well, the students have voted with their feet. They don't like that.
Yep.
But that is the most efficient bit of our business model. So we have to work out how to make given the proliferation of information and the other resources that are out there, we've got to work out for students what are the most valued parts of the education that they're receiving, and that varies, I think, depending on the course, the discipline, and the stage at which they are. So the younger they are, or the less mature they are, the more they need the kind of support that you need from the social dimensions of learning, and the more mature and more experienced you are, the more you need the knowledge, the qualification, the practical components. And because not only do students want all of that, but they're doing it in an environment where the cost of living is high, the level of student support is low. And so they're also trying to juggle all of that with work and supporting themselves as well. So and you know, I wasn't eligible for any student support when I was a student. I had free education, so at least I wasn't worrying about the debt. But I certainly worked the whole time I was a student, but I understood what I needed to go to uni for and where I could work around that. But our students, you know, it's a big juggle, and if you live, you've got to commute because you can't afford to move into the city where your university is. And also, if you don't have great internet at home, which many of our outer metro and regional students don't, it's complex to kind of pull all that together. And I think they need they want more from the more support from the universities than, you know, just there's your lectures, turn up, get your lab reports in, and I might mark it for you one day. They want it's an expensive proposition. They're getting their ending this period with a very good qualification, but also a lot of debt. And I think they quite rightly want more than we've necessarily been able to provide.
So if you could change one thing, if you could make one intervention to improve the student experience, what would it be?
I think it'd be to think about the way we plan our timetables and our work life and how we offer in a different way that requires quite a lot of transformation, either in the individual institution or in the sector or in our workforce, so that we could, again, a bit like the job-ready graduates, not starting from here to get to this point. If we started again and said, we can't do this, so this is impractical, but just to be able to think about what is it about the online resources, the 24/7 student support that we could provide or whatever, how could we use that in a way to better provide experience for the students while still providing a workable life for our workforce. And that requires some quite different out of the box thinking that I don't think we're going to get there just in this current accord, but I think we have to move to that in the next 10 years.
I've got two more questions.
Yeah.
One is returning to you, and the other one is to your colleagues. What advice would you give to your younger self?
I would join the defined benefit scheme in the superannuation, so that when I became a vice chancellor, I ended up a lot more financially secure. But that's when people say to me, "You always wanted to be a vice chancellor," I said, if I'd known that, I would have fought to join the defined benefit scheme. Having said that, now what would I give to myself? I think I would. I probably would have been. Yes, it's hard to know. I think I probably would have looked after myself better. I think there are a period when I was working very hard at various times where I put my colleagues, my family, well, got to put the family first, but my colleagues, my family, my work, and then me last. And I think that meant I probably wasn't always optimizing how I should be and how others, my health. I think that's what I would do. I think I would say, don't neglect yourself. And I know that's selfish. It sounds selfish, but that's important.
Oh no, I that's the same advice I'd give to myself too.
Yeah. Well, I think anybody who's worked really hard at various periods in their lives knows that it takes a toll, and you realise you've got to step back and look after yourself.
So the last question is, what would you say to younger and aspiring senior leaders in the sector now to prepare them, for the next 20 years?
So I think I'd be courageous. I'd say, take a few risks, back yourself, and also that it can be an incredibly one of the wonderful things about universities and the research and the science or the academic and intellectual environments we work in is that there's a lot of freedom and there's a lot of really satisfying things about that career that and security is not the overriding. And so, what I hear a lot from younger academics is, I need security, I need certainty. And I don't think we have that. And I don't think anybody has that. We didn't predict none of us could have predicted what was going to happen in the world in the last 3 or 4 years. And so I think it's be a bit more courageous about, get on, do whatever you need to do, deliver on that, and back yourself, I guess. And that if you do that, then things sort of work out in the end.
Margaret, thank you for giving me 35 minutes of your time on a Friday afternoon. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I certainly look forward to catching up with you in a more informal way at some time in the future.
Visit studiosity.com/studentsfirst for the next Students First Symposium. an open forum for faculty, staff and academics to candidly discuss and progress the issues that matter most in higher education.